All right, I think that's the bulk of everyone for now. So we will go ahead and get started. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our penultimate History Happy Hour of the 2024-2025 season. For those who don't know me, I'm Cody H. I serve as Director of Education and Interpretation here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. And whether this is your first time or whether you've been here for them all, welcome. It's wonderful to have a few dozen people here in our room for this evening, as we'll welcome Jonathan Steplyk here in just a moment. Before we introduce him, I am going to share my screen. I'm going to swap us out here, Jonathan. And we're just going to go through some housekeeping of some events that we have coming up here at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. So we'll continue our Fridays on the Ridge series. For those who live locally, we'll continue this throughout the remainder of March and into April and beyond. We're down to our last probably 5 or 6 that'll be taking place indoors before we move these outdoors for the wonderful springtime weather. But coming up over the next few Fridays, we will have me as well as Caleb Kuzmierzik, our Director of Museum Operations, presenting on a few topics. On March 28th at 3:30 in the Education Center, I'll be presenting about the Civil War diaries of Rachel and Samuel Cormany, part of the Valley of the Shadow project that was introduced a few decades ago by Dr. Edward Ayers. These are a pair of amazing diaries from the Cumberland Valley in the city of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. So I'll be talking about that on March 28th. On April 4th, we'll be focusing on the 160th anniversary of the end of the Civil War. That week and the following week, I'll be talking about from Appomattox to Adams County, Gettysburg, and the end of the Civil War, making some connections between soldiers who fought at Gettysburg, who are instrumental in the last phases of the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. How are the people of Gettysburg reacting to the end of the conflict, and how is the town reacting to the news of the Lincoln assassination? And then Caleb Kuzmierzik is going to be presenting on a topic to be determined in about a month on Friday, April 25th. So keep an eye out for more information on those, as well as locations. We're going to try to keep those in the Education Center. But for those who have been coming, as you are well aware, we have a good problem to have right now. We're outgrowing that space, so we may have to have an alternative location if we burst at the seams for our capacity there. Next Saturday, we have our Tacos and Trivia. This is the rescheduled date. It was supposed to take place last month, but we got snowed out. So next Saturday, March 29th at 6 o'clock, we'll have this in the Seminary Refectory, just across the street from the museum. There are some tickets still available. This is co-hosted between us, Addressing Gettysburg podcast, and Matt Callery, and the food is provided by Jake Schindel and Ragged Edge. Tickets are available for that online. If you go to seminaryridgemuseum.org/events, you can sign up for yourself and your team there. So that'll be next Saturday, the 29th. Our nonfiction book club will continue the third Tuesday of every other month. We have about a month until our next one on April 15th. We're moving away from the Civil War for the next few months. We're going to discuss on April 15th at 1 o'clock Napoleon's buttons. A little bit of a combination of chemistry and history, a little bit different than what we have focused on for the past several. And then on June 17th, one of my favorite books personally, we're going to focus on Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard, about the assassination and the aftermath of the assassination of James Garfield. So we're really happy to continue partnering with Adams County Library and the Gettysburg branch in particular. This takes place, as I mentioned, the third Tuesday of every other month. If you live locally, it's free. Copies of the books are available at the library. If you go to the second floor desk, you can pick up copies of those there. That's at 1 o'clock in the Schmucker House, where our museum offices are located. Our next History Happy Hour next month, we had a little bit of a change up. Gary Manville, sculptor, was going to be our initial guest. He is unfortunately not able to join us in April any longer. But good news is he's going to be doing an on-site program this fall at some point. So keep an eye out for that, likely September or October. In his place, we're going to welcome Keith Harris, author of Across the Bloody Chasm, an educator who was based in Hollywood, California. He's going to be talking to us about American exceptionalism and the Gettysburg commemorative landscape. Do note the date for those who frequent these programs. We typically have them on the third Friday of the month. We're moving that up a week to the second Friday of the month in April. April 18th is Easter weekend, is Good Friday. So we're going to do that the weekend before that. So that's going to be our, believe it or not, final History Happy Hour of the 2024-2025 season. This will be our sixth tonight of these seven. And then keep an eye out for our in-person programming that'll pick up in the warmer months, May, June, July, and August. As always, we'll have, instead of History Happy Hours, our evening sunset walking tours. We'll be putting out our full schedule of those 4 walking tours here probably within the next couple of weeks. The first one, as always, is going to be on the Friday of Memorial Day weekend. So keep an eye out for that full slate here in the coming weeks. We have several other events that will be taking place as well. Keep an eye out for a ton of additions to our schedule, both in terms of in-person speaker events, our battle anniversary schedule. That'll be here before we know it. So really always an exciting time as we have now entered officially springtime, and we'll have a series of amazing events here in the coming months on Seminary Ridge, especially as we start to move outside more and more. Well, without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce our speaker for this evening, Jonathan Steplyk. We were just talking before everybody started to jump onto the call that throughout the COVID era, especially 2020, 2021, there was this large community of folks online who are involved in social media, interpretation of history, Zooms, things along those lines. And you really get to know a lot of those people through comment threads, through the history that we're all sharing and interpreting, the research that we're all doing. And of course, those things have in many ways continued as well. And Jonathan and I got to know one another just through Facebook comments and messages and research that we were doing and things we were finding interesting. And then last August 2024, I was a presenter and Jonathan was a attendee at the W. Britton Symposium. So a shout out there to Ken and Erica Osen, based in Ohio. If you're familiar at all with the W. Britton collectible figures, these amazing, almost true to life, in many cases, miniature figures of a lot of military history, they put on an amazing symposium that has been in Gettysburg a couple of times over the past few years that I've had the opportunity to present. And Jonathan and I met each other in person for the first time at that event last summer. And he had been on my mind as someone who I wanted to bring into the fold in some way to do a program for us. And so it came at a great time as we were starting to plan for our History Happy Hours for 2024, 2025. And he was gracious enough to join us here this evening. Jonathan M. Steplyk is the author of Fighting Means Killing, a copy of it here, and an incredible book that he's going to give us a glimpse at this evening. Subtitle is Civil War Soldiers and the Nature of Combat. He's also a frequent contributor to the Civil War Campaigns in the West series. He teaches at the University of Texas at Arlington and has worked as a historical interpreter at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park and Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park. And he received the 2023 Grady McWhinney Award from the Dallas Civil War Roundtable. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Steplyk.
Thank you so much, Cody, and thank you for all the museum members and visitors for tuning in tonight. Really excited for this. How are we doing, Cody, in terms of seeing what we want to see?
We can see you. You'll have to reshare your screen. I think I took it over since I shared our ad, so you'll just have to do that part again. Still loading. Yep, it's full screen. We're good to go.
You've got it. All right. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. I'm very excited to talk about my book. Of course, it's called Fighting Means Killing, and many of you will likely recognize the famous Nathan Bedford Forrest quote, the extent of which is, "War means fighting, and fighting means killing." And with this book, I wanted to get to grips with that literal notion and explore what it was like, how soldiers felt and reacted to the prospect of killing in combat, especially our American Civil War, this conflict, brother against brother, American against American. What was that dynamic like for them? We're familiar, I think, with talking about Civil War soldiers fighting for their country and risking their lives and sacrificing their lives for their country. And I really wanted to zero in on that aspect. Well, part of that fighting and the bringing about, the sacrifice and death of American citizen soldiers is killing in combat. So how did Civil War soldiers actually think and experience about that very real nature of combat? So I'm going to be exploring a lot of the really, really critical themes from the book. And by way of introduction, let's see here. I got to have my there we go. So I want to give credit where credit's due. There's a number of interesting works that I built on, and there was the intellectual inspiration for this. But for this special talk, and this didn't make it into the book, but there's some kind of inside baseball that might be fun to include. This, in terms of my history with Civil War history, I elected to pursue this topic in my graduate career, but it kind of started earlier than that. And like some of you, I'm sure I really fondly remember the classic, Civil War glossy magazines. Some of them, unfortunately, have gone out of print since then, but America's Civil War and Civil War Times were real staples for those. And I need to track down a couple of ads that jumped out at me years ago. And I think both of these ads were for the famous Time Life series of books. And one had an artifact. It was some kind of gift that apparently Ulysses Grant had sent through the lines to George Pickett. And it had a caption, a real attention getter in terms of something like, how do you send a gift to somebody who's I can't get it as pithy as it was, but whose death you're trying to bring about or who you're fighting. And another one of those same Time Life ads that had that 19th century painting of the fight for the colors. And it had a quote from a Illinois soldier. He had a brother. They were natives of the Shenandoah Valley. He had a brother still in Virginia fighting for the Confederacy. And this quote, he wrote to his brother. The one brother was going to fight for the U.S. cause and the other was going to fight for the rebel cause. And the Illinois brother wrote, if I would strike down my own brother if he dare to raise a hand against the flag. And that stuck with me very early on. And that quote is featured in the book itself. And there's another really interesting kind of ingredient bringing this book about. And that was a product of my reenacting career. So I'm very proud and have benefited greatly from the living history side of studying the Civil War. And I think those who have read the book or will read the book will find there's a lot of things that practical experience very, very much benefited me in very direct ways and saved me. There's a lot of things I had absorbed already that maybe somebody without that experience would have had to buckle down and learn. But I very distinctly remember a event in Hastings, Michigan, and I believe this was a tactical, so it wasn't a scripted battle. It was one of those where it's how the units perform under fire. And this would have been high school or college years, and we are engaged in our tactical event. And across the lines, I spy a guy in Confederate uniform, maybe as young as me, maybe even younger. And we had fired a volley. We're reloading and spotting this guy. And the thought flashed through my mind, I'm going to reload faster. I want to be able to get my shot off before he can shoot at me. And it was obviously this was mock combat, as it were, but it felt like one of those kind of authentic moments. And it kind of geared me towards this topic. And so later on in my professional history career, so I'll especially credit two sources. And many of you are familiar with both of these. The first I'll mention is John Keegan's The Face of Battle. John Keegan was a extraordinary British historian with many books to his credit, very much impacted military history. And Face of Battle is one of his most famous works. It really kind of humanized the study of military history and combat. In this book, he profiles three battles from the English experience, and they're all kind of from a very close proximity in France. He profiles Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme. And what he does very analytically is look at the very human aspect of those soldiers, whether it's fighting in the mud, fighting, men on horseback versus men on foot, fighting in the trenches and so forth. He looks at it, he tries to construct as authentically as possible the face of battle. And he makes this point early on. We're used to talk about military affairs often in these kind of like nice red and blue lines on the map, but those lines, those blocks are made up of flesh and blood human beings reacting as individuals to these extraordinary circumstances. And the next book that very directly impacted my decision is Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman's book on killing. This is a work of military history that really made the subject of killing in combat a subject of scholarly study. Grossman terms his book a killology, this idea of studying the effect of an expectation of killing in combat. And I can credit, this is during my master's years at Penn State, and it was in Dr. Carol Reardon's military history seminar. And we had the ability to choose different books on which we were going to present to the class. I went with this, and it was incredibly important. It captured my fascination, and it very directly impacted my choice to write a Civil War killology. And it's the specific framework that Grossman uses very, very directly impacted many of my own findings. So all of us historians are obviously building on those who've come before us, and these are two especially seminal works in bringing about this book to life. So, having established credit where credit's due, if you pick up Fighting Means Killing, so in my foreword, I try to hook the reader with the incident in the Marshall House in early 1861 that many Civil War students are familiar with. This is the case of Union forces had crossed over from Washington, D.C. over the Potomac into Alexandria. They're establishing kind of a foothold in Virginia. You had basically rebel territory across from Washington, visible from the White House itself, and Mr. Lincoln's troops were going to bring this under Union control. And part of this was that on a local hotel, the Marshall House, a Stars and Bars First National flag, was defiantly flying from there. And part of the idea of this sally forth over the Potomac is to bring down that rebel banner that was in view of the White House. Part of this force was composed of the 11th New York Fire Zouaves, led by Colonel Elmer Ellsworth, a dashing young officer who had done much to establish the Zouave craze that swept Americans on the eve of the Civil War. And it was also a close friend of President Lincoln. What happened in the course of the Marshall House incident, Colonel Ellsworth and several of his men and a newspaper correspondent entered the house, went up the stairs. The men successfully cut down the large Confederate flag flying there. As Ellsworth and his men descended the stairs, out emerged James W. Jackson, and he was the proprietor of this Marshall House. He was a very strident, enthusiastic secessionist and supporter of the Confederate cause. It was his house, and he was very proud to fly his Confederate flag from the hotel. He emerged with a shotgun and fired a shot at close blast, killing Colonel Ellsworth. And you can see this is a number of artworks that commemorate this painting. Commemorate this incident. Speaking of the Time Life series, in one of the early books, this, of course, features on a full page, and this was another one of those incidents that captured my imagination at a very early stage. And I knew from an early stage this was going to be in the book. What you see in the painting is Ellsworth has just been fatally wounded, and in front of him, Corporal Francis Burnell, and you can see his actual photograph there, is striking back with his musket in the course of his encounter with Jackson. Drove the shotgun up. He fired the second blast harmlessly overhead. Brownell was able to shoot and fatally stab Jackson. And so at the end of the day, you've got the loss of Colonel Ellsworth, who goes down as the first United States casualty or officer casualty of the Civil War. And then we have civilian James Jackson, who has also died in the altercation. And for my purposes, what this incident represented is we've got two acts of killing, two deaths. And the Union and Confederate sides of the Civil War are going to find their own heroes and martyrs in this incident. And in the case of Union forces, as the mourning of Ellsworth sweeps the nation and including the Lincoln White House, supporters of the Union cause will be mourning the death of Ellsworth as a martyr to the cause, and they will similarly be celebrating Corporal Brownell having slain the killer of his colonel. Whereas for Confederate supporters, we have in James W. Jackson hero and martyr. He has the killer who slew the officer who is taking down his banner, and he is also the martyr who has died in defending the Marshall House and defending the Confederate colors. So at this very early stage in the war, we have both sides celebrating someone who has lost their life and also the taking of life in action. And next, I want to unpack some of the main factors that are going to introduce that are going to affect Civil War soldiers and basically their ability to kill in combat, to have to kill effectively. And the major thrust of my book is that a significant number, perhaps the majority of Civil War soldiers are, in essence, willing killers. There's a spectrum of emotion, and in the book, you'll find soldiers enthusiastic about the prospect. You'll find soldiers who recoil and are dead set against the idea of taking life. And there's others who find themselves somewhere in the middle, somewhat reluctant, somewhat enthusiastic, and different circumstances will come to bear on individuals. So we can look at what factors make it possible for soldiers to kill in combat and which ones might inhibit it. And I find there's a number of factors that successfully set up Civil War soldiers to fight and fight lethally to kill in combat. But there's also limits. And one of the areas, if you're trying to prepare a soldier, if that your goal is to prepare a soldier to fight and kill for his cause, weapons training is going to be a big part of that. You want him to be able to efficiently, effectively load and fire and target the enemy. And this is an area where, especially early in the war, training tended to let down the Civil War soldier. There wasn't a very strong prescribed course of marksmanship training. Much of the training of the Civil War is how the soldier is supposed to march in various formations, how you're to bring the soldier into combat. He needs to know how to load and fire practically, but there isn't much of, in a scientific way, of marksmanship. Certainly not a top-down method. It's very much kind of left to the circumstances and proclivities of individual units, really. There's nothing that resembles the basic boot camp form of marksmanship training that today's military relies on. So and it runs the gamut, of course. Many soldiers they'll go into combat with very limited experience using their muskets and rifles. Some officers will find the ammunition or find the opportunity to make this happen. As I said, we have some soldiers who go into battle with zero experience. On the other hand, we have some of the famous sharpshooter units who do engage in some degree of scientific, rigorous sort of training, especially famous units like the Union's Berdan sharpshooters, so they actually undergo things like range estimation and so forth. Another factor in training is what kind of target are you shooting at? And if you want to prepare soldiers to be effective killers in combat, you want to get them used to firing at realistic targets, at targets that look like a person. Much of American marksmanship training and shooting frolics and things like that was against various kinds of bullseyes, not anything like a realistic target, which again, a lot of military and law enforcement training uses today. One of the few very close analogs to this, so there's a notable example when, again, Berdan sharpshooters first appear on the scene. And there's a notable vignette when President Lincoln visits their camp. And Hiram Berdan himself, reckoned one of the best marksmen in the country, puts on a shooting exhibition. And Berdan is firing at this canvas target on which has been drawn this caricature of Jefferson Davis. And on your screen to the right there, you'll see a newspaper facsimile of that. It looks a bit more like PGT Beauregard than Davis. And Berdan mentions, he wasn't sure how President Lincoln would feel about him shooting at a realistic or semi-realistic target of his opposite number, the rebel president. And Lincoln kind of laughed it off as a good joke. He found the humor of it. Berdan manages to put a round basically between the eyes of the target, and Lincoln kind of laughs off. That was a very lucky shot, in essence. So the training aspect really didn't prepare soldiers a military institution would want to prepare them. Now, we do see soldiers kind of in their downtime during the war. There's efforts, again, nothing really systematic, but kind of this episodic idea of training the men to be better shots. And some soldiers even kind of like are enthusiastic about trying to be good shots. But what other factors can we consider? A major factor is the tactics used in the Civil War. And many of us are familiar with the linear tactics, the two ranks, the elbow to elbow formations that the majority of Civil War infantry combat was conducted. And you see, might be a number of familiar images in Civil War artwork. Notably, we've got this really grand view by artist Dale Gallen depicting the fighting on Oak Ridge on day one of Gettysburg. These linear tactics, there's this great debate, and you see this among scholars, you see this among layfolk, this idea we debate the efficacy of Civil War tactics. Are they outdated? Are they outclassed and rendered obsolete by new weaponry, or are they still very, very effective? One of the things we can say about linear tactics in their favor is they accomplish what they mean to do in that they provide command and control. You can efficiently move men about a battlefield in a ordered formation, and you can also control their fire. The reason why Civil War soldiers fought primarily in two ranks, and why they have muskets that are of musket length is an entire line of two men deep can fire all their muskets if need be. Everybody is able to bring his weapon to bear. You are maximizing the firepower of the Civil War line of battle. And it's officers' duty to bring these lines of battle in the most advantageous ways on the battlefield. One of the things that these tactics did provide rather effectively is what military science would call fire control. And this is an idea especially advocated by the 20th century writer S.L.A. Marshall, Slam Marshall. He's perhaps best known for a study he conducted, and he argued that a substantial number, a majority of World War II combat soldiers, combat infantrymen, were not firing their weapons in combat, not simply not shooting to kill, simply were not firing. And his scholars have debated the accuracy of that. And Colonel Grossman suggests that, well, there's this innate reluctance to kill, that killing is a stressor on your average human being. And the point of Marshall's study was that the United States military needed to exercise greater fire control to make sure that all your soldiers are using their weapons, bringing their weapons to bear as effectively to engage the enemy as possible. And these linear tactics do work in that regard. They do maximize the firepower. They do get soldiers kind of potentially shooting to kill. Something that's directly related to the efficacy of leadership of linear tactics is officers being able to exercise that idea of command and control. If you are an ordinary Civil War infantryman, you are going to be fighting in those straight lines, and much of your fighting, you're going to be going where the officers order you to march, stopping when they halt you, loading and firing when they tell you. And much of the firing is going to be done on command. And Civil War tactics offered various ways that soldiers could use their firepower, whether it's like a single volley in which the entire line is firing. You can space out your firing so the entire line isn't left unloaded, so you can have front rank fire and the rear rank fire. You can do what's called fire by file, where each set of 2 men deep fires one after another, and that creates kind of this rolling fire down the line. And at some point, especially after that, you're going to get just simply firing at will, where men are just loading and firing in their own time, and usually trying to get off their shots as quickly as possible. This relates to the topic of killology because soldiers are acting under orders. In line of battle combat, the Civil War soldier doesn't necessarily need to use a lot of personal initiative. There isn't a lot of personal responsibility. One element of that is you are being ordered to carry this out. And Civil War soldiers recognize this aspect of combat. Take, for instance, the Ohio soldier who wrote, "A soldier in the ranks was a portion of a great machine and was not to think or use human instinct. On the contrary, to obey orders and look out for himself as a secondary matter was all that was required of the common soldier." And so this feeds into this idea of kind of group absolution. And that's another idea that Grossman brings into his killology, as it were. Much of Civil War combat separates the Civil War soldier from the potentially harsh reality that you are shooting at and potentially killing an enemy combatant, another human being. You're not making the personal decision necessarily. Again, this is if you're in kind of stand-up line of battle combat. There's obviously other ways that Civil War soldiers found themselves in battle. But you are being given orders. You are firing when you're told to fire. Additionally, you are firing as part of a group. And so this idea of group absolution comes into play. You are but one of many soldiers, hundreds of soldiers, thousands of soldiers who are engaged in the same behavior. So it is not as personal, it is not as direct. Many of these factors work to kind of shield Civil War soldiers potentially from the stressors of killing in combat. Something that's very directly related to this is visibility on the Civil War battlefield, and more broadly, the fog of war. So not only are our Civil War soldiers fighting in these linear formations much of the time, their black powder weapons create these acrid clouds of white smoke. And it can, fog of war is a theoretical concept. It's hard to figure out what's going on a vast battlefield, but also in terms of literal visibility, it's hard to see what's happening. It's hard to see the effect of your own particular shot if your weapon is discharging this thick white smoke immediately in front of you. Now imagine hundreds of other men doing that at the same time and sometimes in the right conditions the fog is kind of hanging on the battlefield. So once again, you're not sure what your bullet is doing. It's very hard to know. You might not once the fighting gets thick enough, you might not even be able to see the enemy. You might simply be firing at the smoke and at the muzzle flashes. Simon Bolivar Buckner was a New York soldier, and he wrote, "Soldiers do not take aim after the first shot because the smoke is so thick, but they only bring the gun to the shoulder and pull." And so many of these factors, again, come together. You are not necessarily forced into this reality of realizing or seeing that you are firing a bullet that's potentially hitting someone. You are shielded from it in many ways. Something else that, again, encouraging soldiers to fire effectively is target attractiveness. Is there something about the target that makes you want to fire at him or at it? And in different kinds of warfare, in different eras, we see different kinds of target attractiveness. Many soldiers instinctively shot for the officers. They know, and this is an effective military tactic, the idea that to take out that command and control, to take out the men who are calling the shots. And if you lose officers, we see this in Civil War battles, to lose officers can kind of stymie an attack. It can frustrate your efforts in combat. And there's famous incidents from the Civil War. One of the most high profile general casualties. Well, I could talk about General Reynolds at Gettysburg, but I kind of fall into the I've long ago moved away from the it was a Confederate sharpshooter. I'm kind of in the it's volley fire that brings down Reynolds. But perhaps more or as famous as Reynolds is John Sedgwick at Spotsylvania, who notably his men are under fire. He's trying to inspire them and encourage them and say they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. And then moments later, a Confederate rifle ball crashes in and takes his life. At Gettysburg itself, officers are very prominent in terms of the leadership role. They're often leading from the front, and their actions distinguish themselves. They are easy marks, effectively, in combat. Among those officers who fell, we have here Don Trelawney's rendering of Colonel Burgwin leading his 26th North Carolina. And this is the moment he famously grabs the regimental colors. He's urging his men on, and he's fatally wounded, and he falls, wrapping himself as he falls in the folds of the battle flag. Another kind of attractive target is Civil War artillery. Artillery is obviously a very potent weapon on the battlefield. Infantrymen and cavalrymen learn to respect the firepower that artillery could bring to bear, especially at short range, especially with deadly loads like canister. The disadvantage artillery faced is they are large stationary targets. You have several men, a group of men working a gun. Guns can be moved about the field drawn by horses, but in action, they are very stationary targets, and they're very high profile targets, and you want to take out those gunners. So they, as well as their horses, are going to be very easy marks. Other factors that come into this, some some enlisted men chose to take out officers. Others decided, no, it's not so much the officers, it's the other enlisted men who are shooting at me that I should be aiming for. And here we get kind of, the very simple element of self-defense. I'm going to kill him before he kills me. The famous Confederate memoirist Sam Watkins wrote, "I always shot at privates. It was they that did the shooting and killing, and if I could kill or wound a private, why, my chances were so much the better." In Watkins' mind, officers were essentially harmless personages, and so he wanted to be firing back at the men who were firing the shots at him. We see there's any number of factors that can come into play too. Obviously, the colors, the battle flags are meant to stand out. they're meant to be visible, but it also makes them prime targets. It was, of course, a great honor to bear regimental colors in battle. It also made color guards prime targets. And there's many accounts of how many men of the color guard go down under fighting. In Colonel Burgoyne's example, he's both an officer leading very demonstrably, he's also bearing the colors. There's also some accounts, we talk about the famous Zouaves, their bright, red and yellow accents in the uniforms, and there's some evidence that, they tended to stick out kind of as prominent targets as well. And we see other kinds of interesting elements like this on the firing line. So I examined different kinds of Civil War fighting, but kind of the essence of it is that kind of stand-up infantry fight. And there's all sorts of interesting elements, fascinating elements that Civil War soldiers who survived at least their first experience of battle told us about this incredible experience. It's one that they often struggled to define, but it's fascinating the kinds of reflections they left. And there was a gamut of different experiences. Many soldiers talked about the tremendous anxiety that builds up before a battle, going into this very strange, very deadly prospect. And so there's these keyed up, pent up feelings knowing you're going to battle. And many men found that once the battle started, especially once they're able to fire, that there's kind of a release, this kind of calm sets in. They know what to do, and they are just kind of steely about it. There's this kind of positive release, and historians like Patty Griffith have talked about this. There's something positive you can do being able to fire back at the enemy. Even if you're not shooting to kill, or even if you don't know what your bullet is doing. Another idea that Dave Grossman talks about is this idea of posturing. The firing at the enemy, making that sound, making that flash, that smoke, feels like it's keeping the enemy at bay, even if you're not doing a particularly good job of shooting, or in some very furious battles, such as at Spotsylvania or Franklin, we see Civil War soldiers fighting on opposite sides of the same earthwork. And often it's just a matter of raising your musket overhead and pulling the trigger and ducking back down. You're keeping, even if you're not doing much good in terms of where the bullet goes, you're still keeping the enemy at bay with that volume of fire. A Confederate soldier who talked about this change, this segue from intense anxiety to this steely calm. This is a Confederate soldier at Manassas who wrote, "What a metamorphosis. With your first shot, you become a new man." There's some soldiers with kind of coolness. There's others who enter in kind of uh, a really hyper state, a kind of mania, if you will. Rufus Dawes is among the best known veterans and memoirists from the legendary Iron Brigade. And here I've got, this is that largest image there is the Iron Brigade at their baptism by fire at the Battle of Bronner's Farm. And of course, Rufus Dawes later led his 6th Wisconsin in a successful assault on the railroad cut at Gettysburg. Dawes says of the face of battle, "The soldier who is shooting is furious in his energy. The men are loading and firing with demoniacal fury and shooting and laughing hysterically." It's interesting too to see kind of the thoughts that go through soldiers' minds, like, okay, what, in this hurried situation, this crowded hour, how should you be shooting? And I found some fascinating accounts from the Battle of Raymond in the Vicksburg campaign. This is a Union soldier at the Battle of Raymond, and he talks about this idea of this kind of hyperactiveness, like you don't know where to shoot. He says you generally feel like trying to kind of distribute your bullet so as to take it all in who ought to be hit. So this guy's loading, but this guy has his weapon pointed at me, and like where do I fire back? So all sorts of interesting elements. For some men, again, this coolness under fire, many men likened it to their hunting experience. And you'll see this later. Men who will say, I loaded and fired as coolly as if I was shooting at squirrels or if I was shooting at prairie chickens. And that's another angle, that's another element that Civil War soldiers brought with them that I explore. I'm going to talk a little bit more. We do see elements of reluctance to shoot. There's a couple of interesting episodes I found that made into the book where a soldier is very, very deliberately shooting high, and somebody even tells them about it's like, I'm not going to kill a fellow man. I'm going to be a soldier. And sometimes they compliment this guy. He's as brave as any of them, but he's not going to shoot to kill. An interesting question. Many of us might be familiar with the statistics about the discarded muskets on the Gettysburg battlefield. And a sizable number of these recovered muskets were found improperly loaded. So they have more than one round stuffed down the barrel. And within that feature, some of these had more than half a dozen rounds stuffed down the barrel. Grossman calls this the dilemma of the discarded muskets. And I benefit greatly from his findings. One area where I politely disagreed with him is he suggests that this improperly loading your musket, simply loading the powder and ball down the barrel, not priming and therefore not firing the weapon, is a way for soldiers to avoid killing. That could be, it's not necessarily the best way of going about it, especially, it's getting kind of dangerous and it's getting kind of, as rounds are piling up, and if you survive the battle, you might have to, deal with that. You might get spotted by a sergeant officer doing that. I think it would be far easier to do simply what reenactors do, simply just pour the powder and then fire essentially what's a blank round. I think what's known as warrior science probably explains the dilemma of the discarded muskets better. And basically the stress, the hyperactivity of battle, men are beginning to, we can see this clinically, lose coordination. And there's any number of steps you have to do correctly to correctly fire a Civil War musket. Well, if you load the rounds and if you forget to put that percussion cap at the lock of your weapon, or if you drop it, you can just be pulling back the hammer and firing. And in the heat of battle, you might not realize that your musket itself is not discharging. So I personally attribute that far more to human error. It's one of the reasons why Civil War soldiers, if they're well trained, the idea is you work them through loading and firing, and ideally with live ammunition. You practice those men, because amidst the chaos and stress of battle, you want sheer muscle memory to take over. We don't want you to have to think about the individual steps to load. Your muscle memory should just take over, ideally. Even among soldiers who reflected reluctance, you'll see a number of cases of Civil War soldiers. I fought, I hope I didn't kill anybody, or, I can't know if I killed anybody, and I'm kind of happy with that. A very thoughtful soldier who I cite several times in the book, this is a Wisconsin soldier named Chauncey Cook. He wrote his parents, "I saw men drop after shooting, but didn't know that it was my bullet that did the work, and really hope it was not. But you know that I'm a good shot." And so it's all these different elements come together, whether it's the necessity of firing versus any reluctance you might have. Sometimes instinct's going to take over. Sometimes your reservations are going to take over. It's a complicated matter for individual soldiers. A fascinating other element to this. So things that can motivate Civil War soldiers to fight and to kill. There's simply the element of vengeance, not just self-preservation, but actually avenging your fallen comrades. This is a potentially very strong motivator. And I've selected any number of Civil War soldiers here who talk about this element. We have a Pennsylvania soldier here, Oliver Norton. The feeling that was uppermost in my mind was as a desire to kill as many as I could. The loss of comrades maddened me. You say this is John Brobst, another Wisconsin soldier. He was a very colorful character. His letters home to his wife Mary. In one letter, he writes him, "You say it seems hard to have so many killed. So it does. But we have the pleasure of knowing that we can and will revenge our brother soldiers." John Brobst left another fascinating account. At one point, they had dropped their knapsacks somewhere in the battlefield, and their part of the battlefield had fallen, has been overrun by Confederates. Their baggage has been looted, and he gets back, and his picture, his photograph that he keeps of Mary has been taken. And in another letter, he writes out, "Mary, if I ever find that rebel who stole your picture, you know what I'll do." Essentially, we've got William Bevins, an Arkansas soldier, with these very similar feelings of vengeance. "I thought I would get my revenge for my comrade, so I leveled beside a tree, took good aim at a Yankee, and fired." Even the artwork on this slide that I've selected to show you, these are kind of vengeance moments in their own right. The top is the famous 5th New York Zouaves at the Battle of Gaines Mill. And at this point, the sergeant there, he has seen his brother killed or mortally wounded. And at this point, he's not fighting lethally, but he has vengeance on his mind. The regiment is faltering. He goes forward with the regimental colors and defiantly stands in front of the Confederate battle line, uh, in anger at the loss of his brother. And this move that kind of heartens the regiment, and they kind of rally to the colors. Down below, we have one of the many actions by kind of warrior general Nathan Bedford Forrest. And it's, of course, his colorful quote that provide the title of my book. This is one of his battles from the Western theater of the Civil War. And in this particular battle, he had seen his brother killed in combat. This maddened Forrest, and Forrest was the kind of fellow you didn't want to be on his bad side even on a good day. Well, he plunges into this mounted encounter with Union cavalry with vengeance on his mind. And it's one of those, Forrest is known for the many 31 Union soldiers he claimed to have killed, and having had 30 horses shot out from under him. So he ends the war, one horse ahead, so to speak. So we can't underestimate simple desire for revenge for the loss of men around you, especially as we've seen with actual brothers or actual comrades. Many of us know that Civil War regiments are very closely knit. They are usually products of your hometown, your county, and you're bound to have brothers, cousins, neighbors, friends in the ranks with you. This tight bond is going to bring about reactions like that. One aspect of the book I'm especially proud of is a chapter about the language of killing. So there's the specific details that Civil War soldiers use to describe their experiences in combat, but there's also the words that they choose. And one of the ones that you will see very commonly in Civil War correspondence, this includes letters and diaries and newspaper accounts, but also in regimental reports, this idea of firing, taking deliberate aim. And basically what this amounts to is, well, aiming quite deliberately, taking, sighting and looking for a specific target. This isn't the soldier simply aiming at the smoke and pulling the trigger. Many soldiers will write home this idea of taking deliberate aim. In our own parlance, we would describe this as kind of shooting to kill. It's not random. You are picking out a man on the opposite side of the field and trying to bring him down. Iron Brigade soldier Hugh Perkins wrote home, I have had over 100 fair shots at the grayback, and I have got so that I can shoot just as cool and deliberate at them as I can at a prairie chicken. It has got so it does not excite me any more to be in action, to be in a cornfield hoeing or digging potatoes. So he's taking deliberate aim. Washington Ives of the 4th Florida, he expressed similar ideas. I did not feel any different under fire than I did doing any other kind of work, and I took 20 deliberate shots, picking my man every time, and one time saw the man fall, but the others I could not see on account of my smoke. And that nicely wraps up a lot of these ideas, both, marking the man that you're trying to bring down, but also there's the nature of Civil War combat. Can you actually see the effect of your shot? Do you even want to see the effect of your shot? All of these are just a host of the different factors and the very fascinating reflections that I was able to find looking at so many Civil War soldiers, of course, of multiple battlefields and campaigns across East and West. Those are some of the main ideas I wanted to unpack for our audience tonight. Having said all that, I'd love to interact with you, the members and visiting viewers, and would love to welcome any questions you might have about this and other topics in the book.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Yeah, absolutely fascinating topic. And I put information in the chat for everyone on how to get copies through University Press of Kansas. So this gives us an excellent taste of what is just an absolutely incredibly researched and presented topic. And thank you so much for sharing a bit of that with us this evening.
You're very welcome.
If anybody does have questions, feel free to put them in the comments. We do have a couple there, and I'll relay them to you, Jonathan. Robert says, the bullseye target is impressive, and yet I read Earl Hess argues the average soldier was a poor shot. I'm curious about your opinion of marksmanship.
That's a fascinating topic, and Earl Hess's book is a really important book. So, well, Earl Hess has given us quite a few volumes. This is The Rifle, Musket, and Civil War Combat. And Hess does a great job talking about the limits of what Civil War weapons could do. And there's all sorts of technical reasons for that sort of thing. And I think he kind of followed in the tradition of Patty Griffith. He did a really good job at pushing back against this idea that the rifle musket makes these Civil War tactics totally outdated and useless and so forth. That there's a rich debate to be had there. And he does raise this question about marksmanship. And like I said, there is a lack of systematic scientific training of soldiers. And so he points especially to that lack of marksmanship and that failure on the part of training. My favorite chapter in that book is he talks about the gun culture of Civil War soldiers. And so historians often talk about the soldiers who don't really know what they're doing. They get their musket and you have to explain, okay, the bullet, the powder goes in first, then the bullet. Okay, pay attention to your instructions. And of course, there are men who go into battle having never fired a shot. On the other hand, we have these soldiers who come as hunters, marksmen, and they bring their hunting lingo and hunting experience the way they experience combat. And some of the quotes that really interest me, we have this idea, or we have this problem, especially early in the war, both sides are scrambling for arms. Are they going to get state-of-the-art weaponry or these cast-offs? And soldiers could be very discerning fellows when it came to this. Like, we're getting these garbage smoothbores. I want a nice rifle. Or, you have Berdan sharpshooters is the best example because they're recruited for their marksmanship. They're promised Sharps rifles. They get these Colt rifles, and they are really ready to mutiny over their disappointment. And so one of the things, Dr. Hess and I are in substantial agreement, but one of the things I was really interested in the soldiers, there's room for improvement over time. There's the soldiers who come in not knowing kind of which end of the musket almost. There's some who come in as kind of crack shots, and there's some who are very interested in kind of, okay, how good of a shot, and there's again, it's kind of up to the officers if they're going to make time for marksmanship. One of the smart things some of the units do is like, okay, let's bring them in. Okay, you're on picket duty. You go on the picket line and you're on duty and then you come off. You go on picket duty with a loaded weapon, a loaded musket or rifle. And you can, there's a tool you can use to pull the ball to, empty the weapon, or you can just shoot it. And what officers decide is, okay, here's a target. You guys are coming off picket duty, take some shots. And so we do see this idea, and some soldiers really aspire to this idea. A lot of them, I have a whole chapter about sharpshooters, and there's this idea of are sharpshooters despised, and there's soldiers who despise them, and there's some soldiers like, I want to be a crack shot. So I found a really fascinating array of attitudes towards this. So that kind of change over time, improving one's marksmanship is, I think, one of my exciting contributions to the literature.
Along those lines, a bit, Emily sort of expands on that. She has just three questions here. I'll break them down one at a time for you. So her first one is, any idea what percentage of the Union and Confederate troops were hunters and had experience with weapons and killing a living creature? And I know that's something you go into in your book a couple of times.
That's a great question. And so my research was quite broad, and I took kind of a humanities approach in that I was, looking for themes that were kind of filling out the breadth of Civil War experiences. And I didn't really crunch numbers, and I suppose you would have to do it kind of systematically, right? And it's challenging because you can get a roster of men, like, okay, how do you verify if they bring experience or lack experience? So I kind of came at it thematically. So what we can do is we can at very least get, those who shared their thoughts, who know nothing about shooting or who already identify as really crack shots. This also, this relates to other ideas too. There's certain steps that are going to kind of work you toward being able to kill in combat. So if you've brought down game, if you've brought down a deer, or on the farm, if you've slaughtered hogs, and you'll see sometimes soldiers make references to that, or, butchers or tanners are exposed to things like blood and such. None of those are perfect analogs to fighting and killing men in battle, but they all factor into it. So I wasn't able to crunch numbers, which is unfortunate, but it's a fascinating topic to explore. And I think we probably don't give enough credit to these Victorian citizen soldiers who have some firearm experience, some hunting experience. Those sources, those um, letters and accounts are the ones that especially jump out at me.
Emily's second question, Emily, your question seems to be incomplete in the bullet, but I'm going to make the educated guess at probably how you meant to finish that. Did the soldiers who experience PTSD go into, and it cuts off there, I would have to imagine you're probably going to ask if they went into detail on that, perhaps.
Actually, I can see it.
Oh, you can? Okay, just cut off.
That bullet point reads, did the soldiers who experience PTSD go into an autopilot mode and just shoot?
Okay.
A number of folks have explored this PTSD question among Civil War soldiers. And the thematic nature of my book, and I don't, if I wanted to look at a soldier holistically, from entering the ranks, the experience of battle, and if he survived afterwards, that would be one way to approach this. So I haven't followed a lot of these men. I was especially bringing out the thematic aspects of the accounts. And the nature, and I encourage more power to expanding, our knowledge of ideas like PTSD among past conflicts, and especially trying to understand it today for individuals dealing with it. So, of course, Civil War soldiers didn't have that language. We didn't even have that language in World War II. We go from, World War I shell shock to World War II battle fatigue. So it's hard to find And much of my work is kind of this face of battle approach. What's it like during the battle? So there's definitely room to do more. One of the major contributions of my book was kind of the sheer volume of the willing killers, or kind of the reluctant but maybe effective killers. So that's to adequately answer that would require another thrust of research and maybe more books down the line, more work by myself and fellow historians. So great question. It's very hard to a subject of that to nail down.
Emily's third question, she asked, the sharpshooter's skeleton found in a tree at Gettysburg, was that unusual, or did sharpshooters die in trees?
I would say generally it's unusual to see Civil War soldiers in trees. Now, we definitely, of course, see it happen. We've got that famous Winslow Homer sketch of the Union soldier with the telescopic target rifle. It's interesting too. Homer, as a civilian artist, he says like, I always had a abhorrence of those guys who are actually like picking out an individual man to kill. Sharpshooters in the Civil War are a fascinating question. I've got a whole chapter about them, and I've actually given talks based largely in that chapter. And one of the ways I want to unpack that question, sharpshooter is a very slippery term, a very squishy term in the Civil War, because it can range the gamut from what we think of as kind of a trained sniper, especially if it's kind of a lone man or maybe a team with like your shooter and spotter, or it could be just guys who are trying to shoot well. It could just be skirmishers, guys who are kind of spread out, right? Like there's, see accounts, there's men in that building, our battery is under fire from sharpshooters. And you don't necessarily know if these are guys like Berdan's or Claiborne's men or the Special Army of Northern Virginia sharpshooter battalions, or if there's just guys trying to shoot well. I think it was Patty Griffith who suggested kind of like some sharpshooters are just skirmishers who can shoot straight. So what that means is a lot of sharpshooters are kind of on the line of battle or in the skirmish line. They're in that kind of light infantry role, we would say in military terms. So often they might simply be spread out in front of the enemy. They're going to be very mobile because you want them kind of screening your position or feeling out their position. Gettysburg, of course, is a great example. We've got both of Berdan's regiments in action, and they're very much in that skirmish role. And you do see men kind of going out in this more kind of modern sniper style. And there's definitely accounts I found where guys kind of shimmy up a tree. And of course, you've got a better view. You've got that, to be able to see over obstacles and so forth. I think we see it much, much more in modern conflicts like World War II. So it was done, but many, many times sharpshooters or skirmishers are kind of in a more mobile combat role. That's generally where you will see them more often, but it is something that we do see on soldiers' parts.
Emily, I'll circle back to your other question there in a moment, but on the note of sharpshooters, you kind of hinted at this, Jonathan, but Art mentions about the Union having Berdan sharpshooters. What was the name of the Confederate version?
It's interesting. Some of the scholarship I relied on, it seems that this is a soft distinction. It seems that Union forces tended to recruit their sharpshooters in the war. Like, we're going to recruit guys into these sharpshooter units. We're going to test them out early on. And the Confederates tend to more create sharpshooter units, draw good shots from their established units. And we see a little bit of both on both sides. So the most famous example are Berdan sharpshooters, the two regiments, the 1st United States sharpshooters, 1st and 2nd regiments. And I also like, as a Western theater devotee, I like to call attention to special units like the 64th and the 66th Illinois, which were raised as sharpshooter units. As a native Illinoisan, it kind of disappointed me. You go down the roster and all the companies of Berdan's men came from different states. Where's the Illinois company? Well, in Illinois, guys got together and said, we don't want to send everybody out east. We need our own sharpshooters out here. So among the Confederates, I kind of gave them a shout out briefly before. Um, Patrick Claiborne, the Confederate division commander in the Army of Tennessee, very talented soldier from kind of a professional British background. He was a soldier in the British Army before he immigrated. The British had a far more sophisticated school of musketry before the Americans. And American leaders like William Hardy recognized that and were trying to institute that. And so Claiborne established these sharpshooter companies where they would kind of draw from men who could prove their worth. And they were often given some of the prize rifles, like the Carr or the Whitworth, these very well made, very accurate rifles, often brought over from the British. And they were careful to take care of these weapons. And again, this feeds into kind of the enthusiasm for sharpshooting. I kind of push back against that everyone hates sharpshooters line because it's more complicated than that. They never really lacked for volunteers for those sharpshooter companies and battalions. There's the Army of Northern Virginia had their own sharpshooter battalions that were often used as skirmishers. Sometimes it went into battle in more line of battle. There's a great book out there. I'm going to blank on the author's name, but it's called The Shock Troops of the Confederacy. And it's about these special battalions within Lee's army. And then, so you're going to have, again, specialized or kind of self-designated sharpshooter units. And sometimes you're just going to have sharpshooters again, in which these men are detailed as skirmishers and they're doing their best shot to perform as sharpshooters. But Union and Confederate armies both kind of try to meet this learning curve for uh, better shots, specialized shooters, whether they're kind of skirmishers or kind of these dead eyes operating on their own.
All right. And I will give the last question here to Emily. And as we're just over our time, so I'll give this the last question and we'll tie together all the loose ends. She asked, after the Civil War, did soldiers who didn't own a weapon before the war now want to keep a weapon? How many use their issued weapon for regular use?
Another great question. And that's another kind of hobby horse subject for me. That really keys my interest. So we have a number of interesting phenomenon in the Civil War. Civil War is interesting because it's kind of this mix between kind of homespun and government issue. And so one of the fascinating topics in the Civil War, this is primarily among Union soldiers. We've got guys who, out of their own pockets, will pay for more advanced weapons. The men who, especially in the Western theater, elected to buy Henry repeaters, 15, 16, 17 shooters, depending on which maker of ammo you're using, or the 7-shot Spencer. Of course, the Spencer was in use at Gettysburg among some of Custer's regiments, among some of Custer's men. So we have this phenomenon of soldiers out of their own pockets buying their money. I'm sorry, buying their own weapons. And then in the Union case, they actually, ordnance went ahead and tried to get them the ammo. The going rate for a Henry repeater was about $50. That's a lot if your standard infantry private pay is $13 a month. But many of those Western soldiers, when they re-enlisted in 1864, got a veteran bonus, something like $400 or more, depending on local bonuses. So here's a lot of guys being sent home on furlough with pockets full of cash, and they come back in time for the Atlanta campaign with the latest and greatest in firepower. And so to the end of the war, the US government has more weapons than it needs. It's going to sell some off to Mexico. It's going to keep some because there still is a standing army of such a size. There is an official program by which they will sell them back to soldiers, and I think at probably a pretty good rate. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. I do quote some of the numbers in the book. And I think I'm going to go off the top of my head. I don't know if this is for like pistols or for long arms, but it might have been as many as 1 in 10 weapons were purchased back, or 1 in 10 Union soldiers. I'd have to check the stats in my own book. And some historians have looked at this and said, well, that's not a lot of guys taking home their weapons with them. But I think it kind of is, especially if you consider, so a lot of those, again, a lot of those repeater armed soldiers, they've bought their own. Or in the case of Wilder's Lightning Brigade, they've put money up front and then they've been reimbursed, but they do want to buy them back. And there's a great quote from a Lightning Brigade soldier. They have these brand new 7-shot rifles. Our men adore them as the heathen adore their idols. And other soldiers are going to take back pistols or rifles. Um, Another mitigating factor is for, a farmer, a Civil War battle rifle, a rifle musket isn't all that great on the farm. You're firing a really heavy lead slug. Maybe if you're going out west and want to take down buffalo, it'll be great. It'll definitely bring down a deer. It's probably more powder and lead than you need. So, the smaller bore rifles and shotguns are a lot more common, or a lot better civilian. But we do see this phenomenon, and you see this among some collectors. I'll give a shout out to the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where I did some of my research. They have at least one sporterized Springfield rifle. That's the phenomenon. You take a military weapon back and you do what you want to do to it. You make your modifications to make it better for hunting or target shooting. If you bore out a rifle barrel, and if you like your gun collecting, it hurts a little bit to think about. But if you bore out a rifled musket and just turn it back into a smooth bore, you've got yourself a nice big old shotgun. So there are some soldiers, again, either they put their own money in, or some of them generally want stuff from their service, their uniform, the weapon they carried, and so forth. Collectors can tell you about, we see any number of weapons that have names carved into them, sometimes units, and that's very exciting for collectors if you can ID a piece to a specific soldier, specific unit. If you can ID the weapon to Gettysburg, forget about it in terms of value. And some of that's during the war, some of that's doing after the war, but we do see soldiers kind of literally making their mark and kind of holding on to those weapons they carried as kind of testaments of their service. That's another fun topic to explore as a historian.
All right, we'll give the last comment here. Emily had started her questions by saying, great presentation on a topic I've often wondered about. I will be ordering your much appreciated book. And as we've said a few times already, I recommend that everybody does so. The book is Fighting Means Killing, Civil War Soldiers and the Nature of Combat. Jonathan, you've given us whetted the appetites, hopefully, of many future readers of your book. As we've seen, it starts at the beginning of the conflict, goes even further than what we've been able to go into this evening through the assassination of President Lincoln. The last full chapter in the book is how I was first introduced to it, was research on racial killing and U.S. colored troops atrocities, things along those lines. So those hard-hitting topics are in there as well. A reminder this evening that if you are not already a member of Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center, the link is available in the comments there. Thank you to those of you who are supporters and members already. And thank you for tuning into another History Happy Hour. They're not, of course, as we can see, always the happiest of topics, but always important topics for us to take a look at these macabre and really serious subjects, of course, that go along with our understanding of America's past, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the American Civil War. Jonathan, thank you so much again. Look forward to seeing you the next time you're in Gettysburg.
Look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much, Cody, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, members and visitors who tuned in, and thank you for supporting the Seminary Ridge Museum.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice evening.